Parental excess. When I pulled up at the gates of 69 Trio Drive, the guard recognized me immediately. "Has it really been a year?" he chuckled. "It feels like time should really stop for everyone," he added as he scanned my ticket and waved for the barrier to be raised. I inhaled, ready to vomit some kind of minor witticism, but chose silence. Instead, I nodded, unconvincingly, acting like the passage of time didn't freak me out too. It really had been a year. Once again, the time had come to drop work and briefly disconnect from the people who kept life current. A trip that offered a respite and a chance to return to the bowels of my childhood, and worse, my confused memories of adolescence. This was the only day of the year that I visited my parents, an annual ritual. Since the divorce, my mother and father had rediscovered their own lives, and both proceeded to live, through sheer force of denial, in the exact eras and mindsets that they recalled had made them happier. I could no longer go back to my familiar childhood home. It had been gratuitously uprooted from the modern era and flung by my mother straight back into the late 60s. And that was where I found myself, having rung the bell twice and then opened the unlocked door when no one answered. The reason for the lack of answer was immediately obvious. Music was blaring from the living room and the whole place was in a fucked up aftermath of a party. It was Neil Young's voice. "Hey, hey, my, rock and roll will never die." In the hallway, I saw a photo on the table of my mother and father on a beach vacation before my birth, both semi-naked, flanking a beautiful naked woman. Something about it was horrifying, not the nudity, but maybe my mother's physical and seeming emotional closeness to the woman contrasted with my father's glare, like a man with a long-standing grudge against life itself. So my mother had chosen to return to 1969. She had semi-successfully reclaimed her youth and bygone happiness, and I wandered the rooms of the house searching for her. Everywhere was saturated with the stench of marijuana, couches filled with tripped out but mute LSD aficionados with their wide-eyed stares escorted me all around the place. The backtrack was Neil Young and the occasional distant moan of pleasure. Finally, my mother appeared. Her face was kind of like a flower opening in bloom as she emerged from the middle of a crowd in the kitchen. She squealed with joy, opening her arms in the air and then bowing mockingly in my presence. Someone close by handed me an open beer. I immediately took a long swig. My mother approached me in her heavily smudged makeup and ran her hands through my hair and then stroked my face with the back of her sticky fingers. I realized that she might have just finished fucking and recoiled in horror. I eyed the cohort of aged hippies and spoke with my mother softly but at arm's length, sharing updates of my life. I expounded adventurously on small lies about my love life, my personal successes, and my busy times with famous friends. Truthfully, I had none of these. And I'd misjudged what my mother cared about anyways. She sat herself down in the lap of a pretty blonde girl and looked through me with a hollow expression as she passed gracious judgment on my shortcomings and about how I was too down with society. It was all a little too much standing in a 5-bedroom house being lectured about how a life I had made up on the spot was too mainstream, with strangers chiming in at random times to agree with her. I became agitated and impatient, and finally I had to force my way out. I can't stay much longer. I have to set off and I have to see Dad. Something about those words seemed to change the mood of everyone in earshot except my mother. The chatter and the music both seemed to turn a little bit hostile. My mother rose from the girl's lap, and she held me in her arms and looked at me with her smile. Her face was more radiant than I was used to seeing it. Perhaps she really was happier. You're right. It's the right time. Go to him. He needs love. Letting go of my arms, she spun effortlessly back into the group, ricocheted around from person to person like a pinball, bouncing off bare flesh with a kiss on the cheek here and there, flailing long hair and unfettered bliss until I lost sight of her. I collected my thoughts and returned to the car. Driving past the guard, I held out my hand as if to wave, and he tipped his hat with a knowing expression. Did he attend those parties? Did he drop acid and get freaky? Has that guy fucked my mother? I quickly turned on the radio, wrenching the dial as I listened for signs of reality. The highway ran flat and straight for many hours before climbing into the mountains. At the summit, I finally saw the sign, Elements Tower Nursing Home Facility. It was here, in an old castle, at least somewhat rooted in the real world and the present, that my father had chosen to live and atone for his previous existence. Unlike my mother, he had chosen to live his post-marriage years in the heavy metal 70s, with the drug use to boot. He was asleep when I arrived. It gave me time to study his bedside and count the wires and machines hooked up to almost every inch of his body. His bedside table was decorated with the same artificial flowers that my late sister had brought to liven up the room 5 years ago. Nurses came in and out, taking note of readings and recording details. They would sometimes smile at me curtly before scuttling out, making sure there was no window for any conversation. My father woke himself up when he began coughing. He wheezed, and his lungs sounded as if they were going to collapse under their own weight. Steadying himself, and then his thoughts, he eventually acknowledged me. And I began the same ritual that I completed with my mother just hours ago. We both knew that we hated pleasantries, so I was relieved when he cut me off. I've been thinking, son. I realize I was never careful enough, he began. I'm a victim of excess, and I know you're thinking that victim is the incorrect word. I brought all this on myself. Here, drink some juice. I interrupted him, hoping to deter his speech. I'd heard it twice before. He pointed to some fruit on the side of the table, chopped and carefully into manageable pieces. Motioning with his hands, he asked if I could bring the plate within his reach, and I did so. He continued, have the nurses told you? I have AIDS. That part of the speech wasn't new either, but I never knew how to respond, and each time he told me he would forget soon enough. I stroked his arm. It was increasingly discolored, a patchwork of faded, senseless tattoos. It was as if he was an old sailor and his body had long ago been eroded by the sea and the air and the bounties of those distant lands he must have trodden in. He blinked heavily and his mind seemed to twitch. The hollow milliseconds of confusion between lucid thought betrayed his past, his dependencies on that heavy lifestyle. On the wall behind his bed, the godlike icons of rock and roll were displayed in a mosaic he had made long ago. Curiously, each face had been graffitied over by a stencil that he seemed to have colored in a shade of red that only reminded me of the color of my mother's lipstick. He asked for Cindy, my sister, and I explained that she had run off to Morocco with her pet cat Theodore. My father cracked a knowing smile. He had forgotten she was dead, but he hadn't forgotten my quirks. Your sense of humor is too strange for me, he uttered coldly. We sat in silence for some time. The nurse came back, once again, to check for any change. She didn't smile or make eye contact, and she left promptly. My father closed his eyes once again and fell quickly asleep. I got out my calendar and marked it to visit them both again in a year's time.